Already. So hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining to this, the third Butterfly Talk from Butterfly Conservation Europe. Here we have Chris Van Swaay to give us a really nice presentation about the future of butterflies in Europe. Well, so far, if you can keep your microphone muted, and then later after Chris finishes, we will open for discussions, and you can raise your hands or write anything on the chat. I will be there collecting questions if there are. And well, just to introduce you, maybe many of you know him, but Chris Van Swaay is a senior project leader from Dutch Butterfly Conservation. He is the national coordinator of the Butterfly Monitoring Scheme in the Netherlands, and a really big expert on butterflies, included in the working for the red list of butterflies and moths as well. So yeah, with a lot of experience. So yeah, let's listen to Chris, what he can say about the butterflies of Europe. Thank you so much for doing this.
Okay. Thank you, Christina. So we'll start sharing my screen. If all goes well, then
yeah, we can see it.
See my screen now, and I have to make this small, otherwise I don't see it. Oh, yeah. Okay. Anyway, so I'm going to talk about future of butterflies in Europe. We look a bit back and we look forward. What can we expect in future regarding butterflies? Of course, we all live in a beautiful continent, and you can still see lots of butterflies and enjoy them, like here in the Alps, where it's really fantastic to go and watch butterflies. Or like here, a huge amount of landscapes. This is the far south of Spain, where you have some very special species on these gibbs mountains. Or you can go to the swamps in the Netherlands. So even we have in the Netherlands some very interesting areas like this. Is the place where you can find the Dutch race Batava of the large copper, Lycaena dispar. Or you can go to the beautiful forests in this case in Germany, where you can see species like this Euphorius materna. Actually, she's laying eggs in this case. Beautiful half-open woodlands. Anyway, so we still have a lot of butterflies in Europe, but also we have this. So the pure intense grasslands, especially the Netherlands, is almost covered with them. So let's have a look at butterflies. So we're gonna go through my talk in a few main points. How are butterflies doing? Will we still have butterflies in 20 years, and how can I help butterflies? I already give you a few quick answers, so you have the structure of the talk already visible. How are butterflies doing? Principally, that's regarded by red lists. Will we still have butterflies in 20 years? Well, that's monitoring going to help us on. And how can I help butterflies? Well, join in monitoring, or do 50-minute counts, or do research on butterfly ecology. So now we go into the first question. How are butterflies doing? Now, this is always an interesting question because it matters compared to what or when does matter. For example, when. This is a photo I made in a forest in Poland, where you can see the primeval forest. Is that what we compare it to? Or is it the period in which about 2,000 years ago, where there were just a few people living in most of Europe? Or is it the situation 1,000 years ago? Anyway, so it doesn't matter where you look back to. This is around 1850. That's already, well, of course, it's a romanticized picture, because I know where this should have been painted, but actually you can see on old maps that there was not much woodland actually there. And we shouldn't forget that, of course, this is actually the Netherlands about 100 years ago. Probably these grasslands and fields that you see in the back will be full of butterflies, but for the people living there, it must have been not a very nice place to live. So all these things matter when we look on how butterflies are doing, compared to when, compared to what. The ICN red list looks back actually, well, formally they look at the risk of extinction, and they use mainly data from the last decade to judge if the species is actually in extinction risk. We have the red list of 10 years ago. I show some examples in a minute. It's good to know that there is a new red list in production. We are working on it, and that will be ready next year. With monitoring of butterflies, we can look a little bit back, a little bit further back. We have data, let's say, for the last few decades. Yeah, sorry, I'm a bit ill, but still good enough to give the presentation. So when we look at the red list 2010, you can see that actually the amount of butterflies which are threatened is relatively low. There are a few critically endangered species, some endangered species and vulnerable species, but the large majority of the butterflies in Europe is actually not threatened using the IUCN criteria for the red listing. Here you see it in another way. You can see that most of the species are considered least concerned, so they're actually doing quite well. So what's the problem? We have no problem. Well, we have some problems. This is the only species extinct. At that red list, we were not allowed to call it extinct, but in the moment, everything points to the fact that Pyrrhus wollastonii is now, which only occurred on the island of Madeira, is now extinct in the world, actually. We went there last September to search. Of course, searching for a butterfly in this type of immense, beautiful, but also very impressive woodland is not very easy. There is a person in the on the lower part of the slide, so you can have an impression of how difficult this is to search. Still, we've searched a lot of places, and we think we're quite confident that the species Pyrrhus wollastonii is now extinct. Of course, these forests are so beautiful because they are rainforests. It's very wet, so very often we ended up looking like this. But of course, we also had some beautiful days to search for that species. This is another species which is critically endangered, actually. So it's Colias biamidona, which is a very rare species nowadays, restricted to a few sites in Poland, maybe Slovakia, and in Romania, and probably some further east in Russia and Ukraine. So this is work that we did. Well, not so much we joined in a workshop on conservation of this rare species given by some people in Romania, so in Transylvania, explaining to the farmers how the system worked, what the butterfly looked like, and what they should take care of. This is really a very beautiful landscape. They produced also this very nice leaflet, which they could share. This is the English version, but they also had the versions in Hungarian and Romanian. So also another one of the very rare species, in this case vulnerable, Iribia christi. And this example shows what good research can do. So in this case, species is only known from a few sites in the border area of Switzerland and Italy. And this is two Italian researchers doing work on this species, and maybe you can see them. Maybe I'll switch. Oh no, sorry. You still see the slides? I did something wrong.
Now we see both. No, now it's okay. Yeah.
Now it's okay. Yeah, I wanted to change the point, and then this one. Because here is somebody hanging, and that was not for nothing, because by doing this, they actually discovered that the species was always really rare, very hard to find. But as a consequence, we now know that species is actually much more widespread than we knew before. And this is actually really interesting, because these are the extremely steep sites that you just saw. And here you can see that the Zerebia christi is actually only at those extremely steep sites. And even this little part below, which is actually already so steep that I really hardly could manage to get up, you don't find them. So you have to start climbing to find the species. So this is the site, and you can see this is really steep already. I can tell you that it's no, you can't chase butterflies there. You're just happy that you don't fall down, and then it gets even steeper. And this is where the butterfly actually occurs. So new research reveals actually that this species, which was considered highly threatened, actually probably isn't that threatened, because these rocks are well, only if you are an alpine climber, you can get up there, and otherwise and there is not really much threat at the moment. Let's have a look at what we can achieve with monitoring. So we have trends for 167 species. Most of them are actually very widespread species, so they are considered least concerned, as you can see in this graph. And you can see that that's the group for which we have trends, and there are just a few of the threatened species for which we have good trends following the monitoring at the moment. Of course, it gives us a good overview of some of the species, like this one, a genus Paphia, which is a very widespread species in woodlands in Europe. You can see that the species is actually increasing in Europe. It's also interesting to make, this is a combination which I did of each combination of a butterfly monitoring scheme with a biogeographical region, and for each region I calculated the trend of this species. And here you can see that actually this species is increasing almost everywhere in Europe. Actually, the further south, the better it seems to go, with the exception of Catalonia and a little bit of southern Sweden. So this is clearly a species doing very well in Europe, expanding in Europe, and getting more and more widespread. Of course, we also have these declining species like this Beloria euphrosyne, which is doing really bad in most of Europe. Or actually also Aglaia urticae, so the small tortoiseshell species doing showing a real decline over the continent. Of course, we have mixed trends like this species, Astorialathonia, going down and then up again. Actually, this is what we see in many areas in Europe nowadays. Species is really expanding, probably profiting from climate change. Of course, we have also species going up and down again, as this Lysandra belagus. And of course, we have species like Polyommatus icarus, so the common blue, which shows a really mixed bag. Some countries it's not doing so well, in other areas it's actually doing quite well. So there is other ways to look at how butterflies are doing, and that's the way the European Union does this. This is all of the member states have to report every 6 years on the state of the conservation status of each habitat and species. Now, this is just an example of the huge amount of data available. In this case, this work was done by Timothy Falls and Sue Collins. And in this case, you can see that actually, in this case, Paressia apollo is declining in almost everywhere, with the exception of a few alpine regions. So the alpine region of Italy and the alpine region of Poland and the alpine region of Bulgaria. In those areas, it's still fairly okay. But in the rest of Europe, the species is declining, and even in some cases shows a very negative conservation state. It's very bad. So, how are butterflies doing? To summarize, some species are highly threatened and one is extinct. That's the Pyrrhus wallastonium of Madeira, which I showed. But the widespread species show actually a mixed bag. And for many of the rare species, we only have expert opinions because monitoring at the moment is still not enough to monitor all these species. Let's look at the major threats to butterflies in Europe. It's good to see that from the threatened species, most of the threats are actually agricultural intensification, abandonment, and climate change. And it's important to include the droughts because droughts are really important in that. Let me show. So intensification actually means that grasslands, which look like this and which are very good for butterflies, have been changed to this typical Dutch landscape, which I can photograph just outside the office very easily. So fields and meadows become a green desert without butterflies, and they get restricted to verges and nature reserves, leading to fragmentation. But it's also good to realize that these agricultural areas produce a lot of nitrogen, and which travels through the air and has an influence to the center of even the big nature reserves. The same applies to water extraction, leading to drier circumstances. Actually, the Netherlands and Flanders are typical examples of what the world might look like if we continue. We can also look back a little bit further. So before 1990, using data which has been collected from literature and from museum collections. And what we can see in this case, we look back to around 1890. For example, for this species, Pyrrhus malvae, you can see that it has been declining all over last century, and is now, well, it's now stabilizing, but it has shown a huge decline very gradually. It's not for all species. This is Eparchia semicula. Derailing. Actually, this species was more or less stable for a very long time. So up to the 1990s, this species was still very widespread and common, as in this case in the Netherlands. So I started looking at butterflies in the 1980s, and you could see huge numbers of this butterfly. But now, since then, it started to decline. We lost about half of the populations since then, and we lost about 80% of the butterflies, because always the trend in the butterflies is the decline in the population is always ahead of the decline in distribution. And this is just to give you an example of what it will have looked like. This is actually an area very close to Wageningen. We are actually settled somewhere around here. And you can see that around 1920, this area was full of butterflies. You could see them in each square, you could see lots of butterflies. Now by 1990, we had this 80% reduction, meaning that in most of these areas, you would see much less butterflies. However, they were still in the nature reserves. And this is when we started monitoring in 1990. And now we show that we've lost about half of the butterflies in the Netherlands since 1990. And you can see that this actually means that in these nature reserves, we simply have less butterflies. And of course, if you had to choose, to the right is what most of the Netherlands now looks like. To the left is what it should look like. Oh, wrong set, sorry. And this nitrogen, which travels through the air, is really very bad for many butterflies. In this case, you can see that the more nitrogen is in the leaves, the worse the survival of, in this case, Lycaena tityrus caterpillars are. I always compare it to well, junk food is anything but healthy. A lot of nitrogen means, of course, is something you can grow on, but actually it's the same like eating at the McDonald's every day. You'll survive, you'll grow, but at the end it's not good for your health. Also, we can see here in this case that nitrogen deposition on Dutch heathlands leads to the more nitrogen load, the stronger the decline of the butterflies. So agricultural intensification is not restricted to the agricultural land. On the agricultural land, you lose almost all butterflies. But nitrogen deposition, water extraction, and pesticides work to the center of the largest nature reserves, and as a result, butterflies decline, even there. So it's simply not true that you can put a fence around the nature reserves and the butterflies will do fine. The rest they will simply suffer. We can also look in this case for the Netherlands again, because we have lots of data for the Netherlands. That makes it easier to compare. This is the multi-species indicator that we produced from the Dutch butterfly monitoring data. And you can see that there are 3 periods to be distinguished. In the first period, we had almost only negative effects of intensification of agriculture and nitrogen deposition. In the second period, this simply continued, but we see something else. We see that climate change is coming in. So some of the butterflies actually profit from climate warming and are increasing or expanding. Also, woodland butterflies start to do relatively well. So for a period, this is more or less balanced. And now climate change is actually starting to get very negative effects. So in this period, it was mostly the expansion of some of the more southerly species like Papiliomachaon and Carcharodus alcea. But now we see that the droughts of the last few years start to also have a negative impact. So the only positive thing we still have left is the woodland butterflies. This is an example of abandonment, which is the other major reason, European threat on a large scale. So you can imagine that, simply go back, that these used to be a valley full of meadows and hay meadows especially, and they were simply abandoned. Shrubs come in, and after a while it all turns to forest. Actually, at that moment, it was still very good for butterflies. Fields turn into secondary forest. We have some small patches which remain, but fragmentation, well, one by one, you lose the species because these small fragments, they can't sustain large populations for a long time. There is, of course, also a plus. So it doesn't usually lead to nitrogen deposition. So if you have nature reserves and you preserve them well in such areas, mostly as they are mostly in Eastern and Southern Europe, nature reserves, you can keep them in a better state. And it's also important that the soil is not degraded. After the intensification, like on Dutch soils, it's really very difficult to get them back into a more normal state. And of course, after abandonment, recovery is much easier. let's have a look at how butterflies are doing on a European scale. Now, we don't have data for all the regions in Europe, but at least for some of them. So the 5 main European geographical regions. And I think most of you will see that actually the last few years have been very positive on many regions. Although, of course, in the Atlantic zone, we don't see this bouncing back, but in the other regions, the last few years have actually been very good for butterflies. And when we look at different habitats, so you can also see the difference. To the left, the grassland butterfly indicator for Europe, where you can see that in the last 10 years, actually the grassland butterflies are still in decline. To the right, you can see that woodland butterflies are bouncing back. That's also what I showed in the Netherlands, but that's actually the case in most of Europe. Woodland butterflies are doing very well. Climate change, it's important when we talk about climate change. So far, most people think of the positive effects, like these species from the south coming in. You see more swallowtails, Papiliomachaon than you used to see in the past. So these are all nice things. And you might think that climate change is good and nice to look at butterflies. But it's good to realize that droughts are actually already having an impact. So, and we see more and more, we will see the negative effect of these droughts. Of course, we see mobile generalist species moving north. So that's nice if you want to watch butterflies. But it's also good to realize that cool species get isolated at the southern distribution edge. Here an example of a huge range expansion. Now look at the map butterfly, Rashtia levana. In the beginning of the 1990s, the edge, it didn't get further north, so the green here is what's occupied. It hardly moved into Denmark, and Estonia was the other border. And you can see that by 20 years later, a species moved into completely colonized Denmark and southern Sweden, and was expanding along the in Finland along the Russian border. And it's actually interesting to see that now actually the species even has reached Norway, but not what you might expect near Oslo, but here in the very, very, very north of of Europe, very, very north of Norway. You can find now also Levana. Now, this is a very interesting result of a research that we did on how butterflies are expanding through the landscape. And it appears that spatially dispersed, well, SHNS and H being seminatural habitat. So what we see to the left, if you have it very well dispersed, this is very good for warm adapted mobile species. Let's say the salon species, the Papiliomachaons and the Carcharodus alceas. To the right, it appears from this research that the extinction risk of cold adapted species is lowest in aggregated habitats. So when we talk about Europe and we want to combine areas, it makes a difference how we do that. If we make small stepping stones scattered through the landscapes, we will favor warm adapted mobile species. If we want to preserve the cold species which are left, we should do something different and work to large nature reserves where the species can survive. So this matters on how we deal with the landscape. So I'm going to wrap up. What do we see for the future of butterflies in Europe? Well, there will be an ongoing agricultural intensification. Of course, there is always the option that the common agricultural policy will lead to measures which are more favorable for butterflies. But at the moment, I don't see that happening because it will need a drastic change of agricultural policy. Outside the Atlantic zone, so let's say in Eastern and Southern Europe, we will see a continuing abandonment of semi-natural grasslands, leading to secondary forests, which are relatively poor on butterflies. Sorry. We see a further decline in grassland butterflies, especially in the Atlantic zone. And outside the Atlantic zone, I expect to see especially a decline in the specialist grassland butterflies, much more than the common and widespread species. I think that species like the common blue will still be doing very well. We see more woodland butterflies. The reasons for that are a bit diverse. First of all, there is more woodland. Second, more woodland becomes available for butterflies because of climate change. Woodland is relatively cool, so little rise in temperature already means that more of the woodland becomes available to many butterflies. And also the woodland which is in Europe is getting older. So overall, we are seeing a slow rise in woodland butterflies. We will see a further expansion of climate opportunists, especially outside the Atlantic zone. And we see a further decline of cool species, especially where the habitat is dispersed, so small patches like we have in the Atlantic zone, small nature reserves, which are not good to preserve these species. And as my last slide, I want to look very shortly to the EU Biodiversity Strategy. Now, this is really a very interesting and new way of looking at nature in Europe. And actually, this might be a game changer for butterflies. If we really go to a coherent trans-European nature network, where 30% of the land or 30% of the sea area are protected, and 10% strictly protected in the EU, including all primary and old growth forest. So there is a huge nature restoration plan which is being worked on at the moment. I think this could be, in theory, a game changer, and I hope it will, because it might be really a way to preserve our butterflies for the future. Thank you.